In case you don't know me, my name's Michael Free. I'm the chair of the conference. Other than that, if you want to know anything about me, go to the Discord and you can ask me there. This afternoon, it is my great pleasure to have our first pair of invited speakers. We don't have very many invited speakers this year, so they are very, very small in number and high in stature, or important in stature, whatever that should be. What we're going to talk about today is EMI in conflict-affected contexts. EMI, of course, is English as a medium of instruction. Critiques and emerging possibilities. Our two presenters are Kevin Kester, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Chuncheon when he came out to my home province of Gangwon to participate in one of COTESL's smaller events. He is an assistant professor of comparative international education and peace development studies in the Department of Education at Seoul National University. For those of you who aren't in Korea, this means he's really, really important. His research interests lie in the sociology and politics of education with a focus on UN's education system, peace building, peace and conflict studies, and social theory. Our other presenter is Chang, who's from Taiwan, not from Korea. She recently completed her PhD from the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and is, we all hope, going to be a professor in Taiwan coming up very, very shortly. Her research interests include English as a medium of instruction, EMI, language policy, translanguaging, and bi or multilingual education. And she's been published in System and English Language Teaching and Learning. We are very happy to have you both here. A nice round of applause. And you can see English medium instruction in conflict-affected contexts. Take it away, Professor Kester, Professor Chang. Off we go.
Thank you, Michael, first of all, for that kind introduction and for this very generous invitation to come and to share this work with everyone today. We very much appreciate it. This project is an ongoing project, like everything that I do and everything that we do. So it's not a finished paper that you'll be hearing, but it's more of a talk aloud piece, a brainstorming piece with us. And this is an ongoing research project from a National Research Foundation funded project in which we're looking at the strategies and approaches that university educators in conflict-affected context use when they're working with students in and from conflict contexts who've experienced trauma. So we're trying to imagine, as the changing dynamics of higher education in Korea are taking place over the past decade, and they continue to increase, we are getting more diversified classrooms than we've ever had, including students who are coming into our classrooms from conflict-affected context. So then this raises a provocation for us of, what do we do? How do we work with students differently who are from different contexts? What does that mean? And so we are conducting interviews, and eventually we're going to go observe classes once COVID is finished in Afghanistan and Somaliland with university faculty there. And then we'll theorize around this and then develop a toolkit of what is it that scholars and educators in Korea could do. So that's the sort of overarching project that we're looking at. The paper we're presenting today is just one theme, an early theme, in fact, that Cindy and I have found as we've looked into the interviewed data. We did our transcripts. We've started to code the data and to look for themes that are popping out of it. And one of those themes that came out unexpectedly for me is around language. And so we're looking at language policies and pedagogies that the university faculty have expressed. So that's the sort of project that this is coming out of, the paper that we're going to present. Before we get into the formal presentation, though, we'd like to start with breakout rooms. And we have a set of questions here that we're going to explore together to ease ourselves into this discussion. So the first three of them are more macro in orientation. And we're trying to imagine what are the linkages between conflict and education? So how does conflict impact upon education? And for us, upon language education in particular. Or another way to say this is, how is education affected by conflict? And then the corollary question of this, if we flip it on its head, is how does education contribute to conflict? Or how does it contribute to peace? So in other words, what's the linkage between conflict and education? And what does it mean for us? And then there's a question about transformative possibilities. So what is it that scholar practitioners do within their classroom context or within their wider university context to try to mitigate the conflict and to productively offer some resolution strategies or management strategies. And then the last two questions are they're more micro in orientation. So this is about you and about your higher education teaching context. So do you teach many international students in your classrooms at your university? Do you know where these students are coming from? Do you teach many Korean students who are returnees that have come back to Korea after living abroad? Where were they living? And are any of these students coming from conflict-affected contexts or coming from instances of trauma that might affect upon the way that they're learning? So we'd like you to select one or two of these questions that are interesting to you. And we're going to put you into breakout rooms only for 5 minutes. So we'll go in for 5 minutes. We'll ask you to introduce yourselves to each other, have a quick go around of who you are, and then choose a question or two that you'd like to discuss. And we'll come back to the large group, and then we're going to discuss this more as a large group sort of dialogue before Cindy and I get into this formal presentation. So I'm not sure how many are with us, Michael.
Have I unmuted myself? I have. I'm getting very good at this. We have 12 people, but that includes me, and I can't really move, and yourself and Professor Chang. So let's do 3 rooms, say, with 3 to 4 participants per room.
Exactly. Yeah,
if that's all right.
Perfect.
And how long do you want? Just 5 minutes?
Just 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay. And if you can shoot me the questions, Kevin, I can then broadcast them if it's short.
I'll shoot them to you in your chat box. Yeah.
Okay. Off you go, everyone.
Oh, Cindy already did it.
Cindy did it. Okay, brilliant. Good.
Okay. Everyone's got the questions. Everyone's ready. Fantastic. Hi, Malala. Off you go. Hey, Siri, timer 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes and counting.
Hey, Darren, are you here? Can you hear me? You should go to room 3. If you're having any trouble, just let me know. Wir werden uns heute Nachmittag die Antwort ansehen und den Zeitplan zusammenstellen. Wir werden uns heute Nachmittag die Antworten ansehen und den Zeitplan zusammenstellen. Just for a minute. Hi, Heidi Nam. Hi, James Rush.
Yes, Michael Free, how are you? Good evening and afternoon and good morning.
Okie dokie, Kevin, whenever you're ready.
Okay, yes, we're ready to go back into it. So we're going to do about 5 minutes of discussion around these questions that we just explored together. And again, to summarize them, the first set of questions, what's the relationship between conflict and education? And then the second set of questions, how do these play out within your classroom? Do you have many international students? What sort of conflicts come up in those settings? So we'll open it up to anybody who wants to jump in and say a bit of what you discussed in your small group there in terms of the relationship between conflict and education.
Basically, the 5 minutes was a little bit short, and I think I pretty much dominated it. But I mentioned the fact that in the late 70s, I know, naughty me, in the late 70s in South Africa, late 60s, early 70s, sorry, the language of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in schools directly led to one of the salient events, the Sharpeville massacre, and then the school riots, and Afrikaans being forced on the indigenous population as a medium of instruction was heavily resisted. And as a result of the conflict within South Africa at that time between all the various tribes and various groups, meant that Afrikaans as a language has become, in modern South Africa, a pariah, a language that very few people are actually proud of speaking. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Leonie. Thank you. And I really appreciate the very direct relationship to language education with this one. Does anybody else want to share? I'll share one that came out from my small group. And Joko and I were speaking about our various relationships teaching in Korea and Japan. And what came up for us was the role of multiculturalism. And so the perception in some of our classrooms with our students that the student population is homogenous. And how does that play out in students not then having a worldview that is beyond their own particular community or their state? And that this may be something that contributes to a bit of misunderstanding and a lack of interest in coexistence. So this is a theme that's come out for me before working in Japan and Korea around possibly some myths about homogeneity within the cultures that we live in. Okay, if there's no other response for the first two questions, could we look at the last set? So are you teaching a lot of international students at your university? Where are these students coming from? Are any of them coming from conflict affected areas?
I thought it was interesting that Eric mentioned even with Korean only students, the male students who have returned from military service, many of them are coming from an experience that they've experienced as traumatic, even without any open conflict. The training for that kind of a situation can be mentally and physically traumatic. Yeah,
yeah. I think we often overlook it in Korean society because it's a fairly safe place. There's talk of North Korea within international media. We hear very little bit of it ourselves. It doesn't seem to be a major concern. But with our students, every male that we have in the classroom or that we work with as our colleagues, if they're Korean, with very few exceptions, they've all served in the military, and they have that very visceral experience of having served, so to speak, on the front lines at the DMZ. And that leads into certain psychological beliefs that contribute also to the policies that exist in our universities, very real policies that are based off of service and military. And I do think, Cheryl, yeah, sometimes we do forget about this. Korea.
I think Eric has raised a question, according to
He's got his hand up, but then he ran away. There he is.
Eric, did you have a question?
You're muted, Eric. You're muted, Eric.
Because it's your fault. I never want to be muted, but Zoom hates me. So yeah, when I taught in Tajikistan, it's more on the first two questions. It's not just the people who've been on the front lines, but it's everybody, right? I taught at both Slavonica and Tajik Pedagogical Institute, and if people walk around the streets terrorized. The army was still in the streets with their AKs, and and if you don't know, a lot of the conflicts they're these ethnic things, especially in Central Asia, where they did that thing where they put the Uzbeks, but not all of the Uzbeks. It was majority Uzbeks and some Tajiks and some Kazakhs, and the goal was to fight the ethnicities against each other. I mean, Pakistan, right? It's different. I mean, there's a big difference between what we're going through in Korea and even what our students now, right? Central Asia was a mess. Afghanistan is still fighting, but I think that's the last one that's kind of in active conflict. So unless we have, active, students from Afghanistan in our programs, it's different. It's just different. I didn't say anything. Sorry.
I think part of your point, Eric, that I'm taking out of it, it's a lot to disentangle. There's a lot going on, and we don't want to conflate the forms of conflict that we face in different contexts. They're different forms of conflict, but conflict itself is ubiquitous, and learning different strategies to be able to respond to the particular types of conflict that are in our context are very important. And for this project in particular, the issue is that the different experiences, the multiculturalism, the lack of multiculturalism, the life experiences that students have leads to their interpretations and their responses in a classroom differently than different students. And we, as pedagogues, I think we have to be conscious about the assumptions we're making with our pedagogy and where those assumptions are coming from, and does our pedagogy speak to everybody that's in our class? And so we're trying to disentangle the different pedagogic responses that we can use with different students. And I think more of this will come out as we get into it. I want to add a few things from Eric's point as well. So around conflict's effect on education, particularly in Somaliland, so where part of this project is taking place. After the conflict ended, 90% of schools were destroyed. So students didn't have access to education. So schools are intentionally targeted by different conflicting groups. So schools are destroyed. Additionally, the personnel as well may be targeted. So you may have teachers themselves who were targeted, murdered in certain cases, such as in Cambodia and Rwanda, where they were targeted explicitly by the different fighting groups. You then have an perhaps unintended consequence in these contexts where you have international organizations like USAID or the UN or UNDP that are going into Afghanistan and Somalia, setting up shop. You have NGOs as well that are coming in to run provisional education on the ground. And what these institutions do unintentionally is they siphon away quality instructors from the public school system. So those teachers who were teaching in Kabul now or in the countryside now might suddenly be working with UNDP because they've been siphoned off. They were skilled. So local skilled personnel were needed. They spoke English. They were required or needed in the NGO and the UN sector, and they moved over to the development sector. So one of the unintended consequences is the lack of personnel after these events. Another one is the way that the services that we provide post-conflict target only particular groups that may have experienced conflict and leave out the children or the groups of what are seen as the perpetrating community. And this service of only a select group of society then serves as well to reignite the animosity between these different groups. And we see this in Afghanistan as well, for example. So these are some of the, not little, but some of just a few examples of the ways in which the relationship between conflict and education is crucial to look into. So we're going to go into the formal presentation a bit more now. Okay, so outline, it's basically a research paper, so that's what you're going to get. Background, research design, qualitative comparative study, some theory. For this paper, we're looking at border thinking and post-abyssal thought. Speak more about that briefly in a moment. Findings, we're going to focus more on the findings. So Cindy has a lot to say about the ways that the theme around language policy in the universities as EMI, how this is affecting different tensions in these contexts. We'll have some discussion before we wrap up, and then we'll conclude. So the background, why does all of this matter? So there are, according to our best estimates, there are about 60 million children out of school today. Today, in fact, it's many, many more because of COVID-19. But take away COVID-19 in a normal year, so to speak, there are about 60 million school-age children out of school. More than half of those children are in context affected by conflict, with it expected that by the year 2030, 2/3 of children out of school and 80% of the world's poor will be living in conflict zones. We know as well that research coming out of Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, places like this, that lack of access to education is a driver of conflict. People fight to get access to education. In Sierra Leone, it was a rationale for why the militia group was fighting. Their children didn't have better opportunities because they couldn't get in schools. We also know that biased and radicalized curriculum contributes to conflict. So if teachers are teaching hatred toward another group, that contributes to conflict. In contexts like Korea or the UK or the United States, we also know that inequitable access to quality education is a driver of feelings of resentment, of relative deprivation, and these ideas that one group is being treated better than another also lead to different forms of conflict. It's probably not full-blown war, but it is more micro-level conflict on the ground. So all of this has led the World Bank to declare that conflict and insecurity is the primary development challenge of our time. Now they're talking in terms of environmental conflict in society. UNESCO said the same thing when it comes to curriculum and pedagogy. So if the international community wants to ensure universal access to quality education and safe places for learning, then addressing conflict and peace is an imperative. Achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is dependent on mitigating conflict and providing equitable access to quality education. But conflict is everywhere. The increase in violent conflict in recent years is in middle income countries. Almost 9 out of 10 violent deaths in 2018 were in countries not at war in the traditional sense. So this is research coming out of the Carnegie Foundation. Now, what does that mean? So in the picture on the right, South Africa had twice as many violent deaths in 2018 than the war-torn country South Sudan. And the Philippines had as many homicides, or more homicides rather, than Afghanistan, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And many of us who are from the North American context know as well that in the US, gun violence has reached epidemic proportions in schools. Hence, not only is conflict and peace building an urgent matter for conflict-affected contexts, but it is also an important agenda for all countries and educators everywhere. So there's a need then to rethink what conflict-affected means, which Eric and I were discussing at the beginning of this, and to address its root causes, as well as to plan educational responses that do not exacerbate conflict, but that instead offer possible ways out. So understanding conflict, if we look to the literature, what we'll find from the 3 handsome old men that you see on the right is that conflict should not just be thought of as a behavioral outcome, not just direct conflict of fighting and war, but there are cultural and structural elements to this. So specific to language education and this project is the work of Pierre Bourdieu and Paulo Freire, who speak about epistemic violence and symbolic violence. And what they mean in terms of symbolic violence, for example, is linguistic biases. So what are the linguistic biases that we have in our particular context? So what are hiring policies, for example, for TESOL faculty? This was a conversation point of a paper that was presented a few days ago. Self-regulation, how we self-regulate ourselves in terms of the accent that we adopt or in terms of the way that we address. Are there aspects of this where people feel constrained, that they're not allowed to live out their culture because their culture is not the dominant one, and therefore they must readapt to the mainstream expectation of what an educator is? So this, Bourdieu speaks about this as symbolic violence. Freire doesn't use the language I'm about to use, but his work has contributed to this, which is epistemic violence. So the idea that what we teach and learn in universities comes from particular cultural backgrounds and cultural norms that have been assumed to be universal, and therefore they are not questioned. But the pushback from the decolonial community is to challenge the idea that those are universal norms and knowledge systems. So epistemic violence is in the literature. The other thing we find is there are two faces of education. So on the one hand, the common assumption is that education contributes to development, contributes to peace, makes everything better. Education is unquestionably good. Common belief. Now in conflict-affected context, Elizabeth King wrote a book about Rwanda, where she detailed the way that the Ministry of Education made an intentional choice not to teach about the genocide after the genocide, because they didn't want it to reignite animosities in the classroom. That lasted for about 15 years, seemed to be a pretty good policy. Like, for now, let's not talk about this in the schools. But in 2010, they switched the policy. They now discuss it in a conflict sensitive, at least they try to discuss it in a conflict sensitive way. So this is a way in which the Ministry of Education made an intentional decision to try to not allow education to contribute to the conflict. Another example comes out of Afghanistan from Dana Bird. So her book is in the picture to the right. And in chapter 3 of this book, she talks about jihadi curriculum. This will probably surprise you if you've never come across it before. The American government in the 1980s, through the American government, funded the University of Nebraska to develop a curriculum for Afghani schools. The American government, sharing what they believe to be the interests of the Afghani people, to push out the USSR from their territory. And so this was a sort of anti-colonial narrative on the one hand. The American government also knew, or rather let's say the curriculum developers who were in Nebraska knew about the importance of Islam to the Afghanis. And they knew about jihadi, what jihad meant. So they integrated jihad into the curriculum to teach young Afghani kids to kill Russians. This is not hyperbole. This is very real. And the textbooks still exist and they still use them today in many schools, not all, but many. However, as might be expected, and some of these lessons are with M16s and Kalashnikovs showing the killing of the other. That other today is, of course, not the USSR. They've updated it to the Americans. But this curriculum started or created by the Americans is a very clear example of how curriculum can contribute to the conflict and violence. Okay, now back to the Korean context. Now, what does it mean for us? We have a lot of major changes going on. Two of them that are interrelated at the moment: low birth rates, losing numbers of students who can come to university. Universities are worried about their survival. At the same time, we have internal migration, both for the workforce and also for students. So in 2019, or rather this is research out of 2019, but it indicates that since 2015, there's been a reduction of 100,000 students every year in Korean universities. So by this point, we've lost 500,000 students at the very least. At the same time, however, there's been an importation of more than 100,000 international students. Last year it was 170,000, but before COVID, it was 170,000 international students that were brought in. Most of them are coming from China and Vietnam, so they're coming from the global south, but we also have an increasing number coming from conflict-affected contexts like Pakistan, like Nigeria, like Colombia. I teach students myself who are from these contexts. So if we look at the literature in Korea, this is what different scholars here have said. In Korea, typically peace and conflict is linked together with multiculturalism. So like the conversation Yoko and I were having. So can we learn to coexist with others? Is there diversity in our society? What does it mean? So Sun and Kwon have shown the ways that curricula in Korean textbooks is monocultural and how this creates tension, particularly for young people from multicultural families. Now, again, there's another surprising statistics for you here at the bottom of the page. In 2020, it was projected that 1/3 of all children born in Korea had an international parent. 1/3 had an international parent in Korea. Okay, now let me clarify, because I know this is a shocking statistic. So this is a statistic from Moon in 2015 projecting what was going to happen in 2020 based off of trends in 2006 if those trends continued. That was from research out of Yonsei University. Is the number that high? I don't know. I have my doubts, to be honest. But what we definitely do know is that there are 5% of families in Korea are multicultural families. The Korean government defines a multicultural family as a family that has one Korean parent and one non-Korean parent. Mostly they're from other Asian countries. So what we know is the number is somewhere between 5 and 30. What is left out of the 5% are the families that are wholly international. So a lot of my colleagues, international parents, international children, they're not counted in that statistic. So we know it's more than 5%. We know the top end is probably 30%, but probably not there. Basically, the point is there's a lot more diversity than we realize and that we're trying to learn what to do with. Okay, conflict-sensitive education. We're doing our research in 2 universities. Case University A in Afghanistan, Case University B in Somaliland. We're mostly using data today from Afghanistan for this talk. The university in Kabul was created after the conflict. It was established somewhere in the late 2000s. It was developed to try to contribute to post-war development. It's a comprehensive university, offers subjects across different disciplines. There are about 1,700 students, including 1/3 of them are women. The university has experienced and continues to experience terrorist attacks. A notable terrorist attack was in August of 2016. The Taliban entered the university with car bombs and then executed 13 members of the university. The university in response built further fortification around the campus and additionally built sniper towers and have snipers on campus to defend themselves. They also have, as the faculty told me, a evacuation plan that is in place with essentially something like a tunnel to get out of campus if needed. So they are living directly under conflict. Case University B similarly has experienced conflict. They're also walled in. They were also built post-war in Somalia in order to contribute to the development of local professionals. So these are the 2 universities we're working with. We'll speak mostly about Case A today. These are the participants currently. So from our first round of interviews, we've done 8. We are expecting to do 20 when we're finished. And so you can see the 3 here from Afghanistan, 5 from Somaliland, from a variety of disciplines. They're not only on politics and history, but they're across business, English, politics, economics, anthropology, education. So mostly the social sciences. And that was an issue actually that comes up in these universities, is they don't have a lot of science. the capacity is primarily in social sciences and humanities. But these are our participants. Let me speak very briefly before I pass it to Cindy. We're using post-abyssal thought. Is Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Walter Mignolo are the people that informed our thinking. To make it simple, they try to express, they think that the world is divided between two different regions, at least in people's psyche. There's a region, the imaginary line is called the abyss. There's a region called the global north. There's a region called the global south. On the northern side of the abyss, it's a civilized world. On the southern side, it's uncivilized. On the northern side of the abyss, there's knowledge, there's law. On the southern side, there's no knowledge. There's not no knowledge, but it's not law abiding. So these are, they're critiquing this obviously, but they're saying this is the way that the world is often articulated, worldviews. Now, what that leads to, for example, in our context to sort of apply this, it can help to explain why migrants who come from the global north to the global north are called expats, for example. So many of us who've come to Korea from North America, from Canada, from the UK, we're expats in this context because we're on the same side of the abyss. We're law-abiding, developed countries, while those who are coming from the global south are often referred to as refugees, as migrants, as immigrants. And so here we might think of a lot of our colleagues who also teach English, but are coming from the Philippines. And there's a different perception of who they are because they're on the other side of the abyss. So what this does for us as analysts is it helps us to distinguish how different people on different side of that abyssal line are treated differently. If you're coming from the north or the south, you're treated differently. If you're coming from a southern developing context, you're treated differently than if you're coming from a southern conflict-affected context. Not to mention racialization and race politics and all of these issues. But this helps us to make sense of the data that we're finding. Now in education, Paris Gave has applied this to curricula. So his is a book to look at. Raywin Connell has theorized again around the way that university education is dominated by Northern knowledge. And the ways that this, she says there are 4 ways that this excludes or reinforces Northern superiority: through claims of universality, that knowledge from the North applies everywhere; through reading from the center, so only reading work that is written in the global North; through gestures of exclusion, by leaving out work from the South or theorists from the South, from the reading list, from the discussions, and through grand erasure by simply not talking about it. So Raywin Connell helps to develop or to relate Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Mignolo's ideas specifically to education. Okay, so without further ado, that's a lot of backstory. We're going to go into the data about EMI and about language, and Cindy's going to explain more.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, for giving us a very detailed account of the background of our study and also the research design, as well as the theoretical underpinnings behind it. So now I would like to move on to the language aspect of our study. Before that, we might be thinking in our heads, what does TESOL or the wider field of ELT have to do with conflict? And here I would like to share with you a number of notable articles that are published in well-read journals in our field, such as TESOL Quarterly, Applied Linguistics, and the Journal of Language, Identity, and Education. So these articles were published post 9/11, and they broadly discuss how the field of TESOL could intersect with conflict. In other words, how might TESOL indirectly contribute to conflict, and how might conflict influence the way that we practice TESOL on the ground? So later, when I discuss some extracts from our interviews, I will refer some of the discussions back to these papers, and I highly recommend these papers. It will orient us towards discussing conflict in our field. So I will zoom into the language aspect in Case University, and a note to mention is that this language focus was not originally part of our research design. We became interested in this focus on language because it emerged as an important theme during the stage of data analysis. So as Kevin mentioned earlier, this presentation serves more as a think aloud task to invite reflection and dialogue with all of you for us to reflect on the broader field of TESOL, EMI, and more specifically EMI in Korea. So in the next 15 to 20 minutes, we will look more deeply into the Case A University, which is an EMI university situated on the border between the West and Afghanistan. This is not just a metaphorical expression, but also has linguistic, cultural, and epistemic implications. So a little bit of background of the higher education situation in Afghanistan. Currently, there are 30 public universities and 70 private higher education institutions in the country. Now, the number may vary from sources to sources, as it very much depends on whether universities or higher education institutions that are not accredited are counted or not. So some of the universities, they offer degrees, while others provide professional qualifications, such as certificates or diplomas. The development of higher education in Afghanistan started taking roots in the second half of the 20th century. However, a lot of the development has been hampered by foreign aggression as well as infighting. The current landscape of higher education in Afghanistan still remains very fragile due to a heavy reliance of foreign assistance, weak infrastructure, and also a lack of resources and teaching faculty. The Ministry of Education in Afghanistan is very much aware of this, and they have been trying different ways to improve the situation. For example, in 2005, the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan introduced a 10-year strategic plan to try to kind of address the problems in higher education. And surprisingly, among the goals listed, EMI was one of them. Now, to what extent actually EMI is implemented on the ground is still definitely a question. But in the past 5 years, the Ministry of Education has continued this focus on EMI, especially in areas or in subjects in engineering and medicine. So this university, Case A University, is an EMI university, as can be seen in the mission statement that is highlighted on the university website. Let's have a look. So it says the mission of the university is to provide world-class higher education that prepares leaders to meet the needs of Afghanistan and the region. Academic programs except language arts and selected practice-oriented courses in the law major will be generally taught in the English language. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the idea of an English medium university was created because there was this perceived strong desire for English among the student body. And from the interview data that we collected with our participants, many of them have expressed that they get a sense from their students that English makes them become more competitive. There's a sense of prestige attached to the English language, and students feel that English empowers them. Most of the students in the university are bilingual or multilingual. Dari and Pashto are the two official languages in Afghanistan. There are also a number of other languages in the country, such as Uzbek, Urdu, and Turkmen. So the status of English in Afghanistan started rising after 2011, when the Taliban regime collapsed and when the American troops arrived. This also coincided with the development of technology, mass media, and the internet, which are multiple forces that kind of contributed to the desire for English. Importantly, as educators, something very interesting to notice is that English is also part of the also a compulsory subject within the curriculum, starting from year 4 all the way to university. However, according to a very recent report published by the British Council just last year called The Conditions of English in Multilingual Afghan, that report showed that even though, although English is taught very early years in Afghanistan, the outcome of this education is not so promising. So according to that report, about 90% of grade 12 students have an English proficiency level of CEFR A0 or A1. And for the English language teachers, their English language proficiency is somewhere between A1 to A2. To some extent, this result is not too surprising, as the provision of not just English education, but any kinds of education in Afghanistan is very much disrupted by the ongoing conflict and war that is going on the ground. So this university, Kester University, is very much aware of these linguistic challenges. Next slide, please. Thank you. So they have a number of measures in place to help kind of prepare their students to learn in English in a higher education context. For example, there's an English proficiency requirement set for potential applicants. So the applicants, for example, they could supply a high school diploma from an international school where the language of instruction is English to show as proof that they could cope with the EMI demands at the university, or they could supply their IELTS scores. If they reach a score of 6 or above, then they can apply to this university. If the students don't meet this requirement, they can enter into the academy program, which is like an intensive 15-week course, a collection of courses covering math, IT, and English. The focus is on English, and this covers grammar, reading, writing, speaking, EAP, and ESP. These are all from the university website. So we can see that a strong support system is in place to help the students to kind of improve their English language to learn in this particular university. So everything seems to be very perfect right now, like all the technical perspectives of EMI is addressed. Does this guarantee that there will be no problems in this case a university that is related to EMI? In the next few slides, I will talk more broadly about issues related to language, culture, and knowledge that emerged from our interview data. So, sorry. So in our interviews, there are 4 themes that we have identified that are related to this broader category of language, culture, and knowledge. These 4 themes are provisionally labeled as the liberal white savior, accents and race, English, Dari, and Pashto, and finally, Shakespeare and Dickens. In the next few slides, I'll unpack what each of these labels mean. So one of the very interesting and thought-provoking themes that emerged in our interview data was the idea of a liberal white savior. Let us have a look at what this participant has to say. So, I'm struggling every day with the majority of our international faculty feeling that they are coming to Afghanistan to spread their vision of quality knowledge. It is a liberal white savior mentality. It's not that I will evangelize you, but evangelize you with compassion, with all my, liberal ideas like spreading democracy. Liberals can hide under a veneer of diversity and inclusion, but at the end of the day, they act in a way like I'm their white savior coming in with my knowledge, and I cannot expect too much from the Afghan students. They're not the same as me. So this long extract also raises a lot of uncomfortable questions, and it also draws our attention to the evolving roles of English in the field of ELT. ELT, English language teaching, historically has been very much involved with the spreading of Christianity. Over the years, the ELT industry is more tied to projects of modernization, and also more implicitly and somewhat indirectly could be related to liberal values such as democracy or human rights. Now, these concepts themselves, like democracy and human rights, might not be problematic themselves, but the way that they're imposed in a conflict-affected context could be the cause of the problem, because such liberal values are not necessarily invented by the West or owned by the West. So this imposition of particular kinds of ideologies is oftentimes the source of potential conflict. This also resonates a lot with one of the articles that were shared earlier at the beginning of the presentation, which was published by Nelson Appleby in 2015 in the TESOL Quarterly Journal. So this raises questions related to the multiple involvements and entanglements of English in conflict-afflicted contexts. And it prompts us to interrogate the vested values and vested interest behind the promotion of English. So the next slide. So the second thing that I will share over here is related to accents and race. And this again also raises very uncomfortable discussions about how students react to certain how they respond to the teaching of different faculty members. So this participant over here recently has realized that there seems to be a lot of racist comments from the student side. And these comments, unfortunately, are often targeted to faculty members who are non-white and non-Western. Specifically, there are 3 faculty members at the university from Sudan, Yemen, and Nigeria who are often targets of attack. The students complain that they could not understand their English because of their accents, and sometimes this kind of complaint can be extended to something that is more irrational and unprofessional. So how does a faculty member deal with such kind of comments? This participant says that this situation is getting even worse during the pandemic, as the students do not have enough opportunity to interact with their faculty members or their peers from different ethnic backgrounds in an online learning space. So this tension becomes exacerbated during the pandemic, unfortunately. Now, this is not unfamiliar to many scholars. In an old article published by Karmani in 2005, he does a lot of research in the Gulf context. He also said that ELT teachers of Egyptian, Jordanian, Palestinian, or Sudanese descent are routinely vilified in their workplace. Oftentimes, the attacks are not really based on professional reasons. They could be just because of their skin color, and could be extended to just because their accents are not considered standard, their teaching methodologies and the content that they teach are considered outdated compared to their white peers. So this raises a lot of uncomfortable questions that actually does kind of, when I was analyzing this data, definitely reminded of some situations that we also see in the East Asian context. And a point to mention is that, last point to mention was that, so I had a discussion with Kevin about like, where do the students' racist comments come from? So one thing that we think is that the students might not be familiar with different accents that are outside of the inner circle of Katru's model. And that is probably why the animosity or misunderstanding comes from. And the other thing is that this could also be an unintended outcome of the overemphasis of English in Kester University, which is an EMI university. So in some sense, the strong promotion of EMI could potentially lead to such situations. Is it okay if I continue, or is there anything urgent I should address? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was double muted because I just had maybe a question. I'm sorry,
Sure.
maybe you covered this, or maybe you'll get to it. I'm doing kind of 3 things at once, but I wanted to jump in here and just say that in where I teach, a lot of the attitudes they're just reiterated by the students, and they're actually taught this. They're taught that they're going to learn English from white guys named Michael. And I'll tell you why, because we have a dozen people in my department. The majority are white, the majority are men, and 3 of us are named Michael. And the students, they're kind of sick of white guys named Michael. I mean, they like me, but the other 2, they can go. But, and the students want that, and we talk to them about it. And I do pronunciation things where we look at different accents, just within the United States, where there's a neat YouTube video that goes through 50 different accents. And the students, you can see their minds are blowing, but in a good way. They love it. But their professors, who aren't named Michael, who aren't white, they just, they're just recycling these old ideas about native speakers, that we're here to just teach them pronunciation. And there's only one kind, or maybe 2, British or American. And I think that's where their attitudes are coming from. They haven't really critically examined them at all, which is why I love to get them in my classroom so I can switch things around a little bit. But maybe we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I think you have pointed towards these things. I also identify in the Taiwanese higher education context. Mm-hmm. Because very awkward when you kind of hear these things and you think about it, wow, how should I address these? And we don't want to essentialize particular accents with particular races. And oftentimes we also would want to try to understand where the students are coming from and whether they're overgeneralizing certain incidents to like the entire faculty or the entire university. So yeah, like I definitely think that the field is becoming more aware of how accents could be racialized, and people, faculty members, like I believe all the scholars coming to COTESOL are naturally interested in these concepts, and they do want to become more linguistically and culturally sensitive. And oftentimes the linguistic reality is just more complex than what can be explained in research or in literature, and often depends on a lot of contextual judgment. Probably I'll be able to talk about it in a more coherent sense later when I continue. Yeah. But thank you for your comment.
You're welcome. John Breckenfield has his hand up, and I'm going to stop talking now.
Okay.
Oh, just quickly, I was just thinking, so in it's a systemic level as well. And Michael, do you know off the top of your head, is that still the requirement? Like EPIC teachers must come from 7 nations?
Yeah.
Designated nations?
Yeah, they're the designated nations, and the explanation we get, which on the surface is correct, is that, oh, it's not us, that's just the national immigration policy. It's a policy that we have no control over, we can't do anything about it. So yes, we completely understand. They don't understand maybe, but that's, they're like, my hands are tied, what can I do about it?
Yeah, and Leonie's, your comment is, very, very sadly relevant, I think. And Michael, just one more thing I was going to say. Michael, you have a plug for the 3:30 native speakerism?
I wasn't going to, this is not planned, by the way, anybody, but yeah, we're going to talk about native speakerism and why we can't resolve it at 3:30 in this room with 4 or 5 or more other people.
Yeah.
So
I'm planning to attend that session. Much looking forward to it. Yeah, I definitely feel that lots of times I'm aware that me as an Asian looking person talking to this in front of many white people or Caucasian speaking ELT teachers, a very important point that I want to emphasize is that it is not meant to be accusatory. I'm very much aware that as an Asian, for example, in the Taiwanese context, lots of times Taiwanese are also contributing to this dichotomy. And I suppose in the Korean context, for example, they have this, according to what all of you have said about the regulations of they want certain types of teachers from these particular 7 countries, or they want to avoid teachers from a particular set of countries. So sometimes we are also involved in the process of reinforcing these different categorizations, right? And I think this involves all professionals to speak up whenever they have the opportunity. So also we have to be, as Asians, native speakers, non-native speakers, we're all part of this process. So standing in solidarity with those who are marginalized or could be oppressed is something that we constantly have to be engaged with and to reflect upon. Yeah. So I'll just continue with the next theme. So the next theme is related to the representation of different languages on the campus. And this would basically cover primarily English, Dari, and Pashto. So the language situation in the university is more complicated than it seems. Behind the EMI label, there's a lot to talk about. As mentioned earlier, the working language in the university is English, and most classes are taught in English, except for some classes that are under the Department of Law, or courses that are related to translation studies, and those classes are taught in Dari or Pashto. If we have a look at the university website, everything is presented in English. There's no option to choose the content to be displayed in Dari or Pashto. Now, this particular extract is also very interesting. Let us have a look at it to kind of understand the complexity of the linguistic reality on campus. This participant says, when I arrived, there was a Dari language class, so I corrected it right away by opening a Pashto class as well. Our students and the national administration still put an emphasis on Dari. The Pashto students feel that they are being marginalized. That has nothing to do with English. If we had a language conflict, it would be that split between those 2 Afghan languages. So there are many points that can be unpacked from this extract. I would say a lot of these are related to the ideologies that specific types of ideologies that are attached to different languages. For example, from this extract, we get a sense that English is considered a neutral language, and Dari and Pashto are national local languages. However, Pashto is even further marginalized and often stigmatized based on this participant, what she told us later in the interview. Pashto is oftentimes indirectly connected to terror in the Afghani context, and the root of this connection can be traced back to the early 1990s when the Taliban group started to emerge as a Pashtun movement in northern Pakistan. So this tension between Dari and Pashto is still around currently. This tension is also echoed in the British Council report that I mentioned earlier, published last year. The author of the report, Professor Coleman, and his Afghani research team conducted a linguistic landscape analysis in Afghanistan, and they tried to kind of understand the patterns of how language are presented in public spaces in Afghanistan. And what they found out very interesting was that oftentimes when Dari and Pashto emerged, English was often there. It served kind of like a glue to connect these two languages and also to cover up something more serious, which is the reluctance of Dari and Pashto speakers to acknowledge each other's languages. So this might seem to justify the use of English in this context, but is it really the case? If we turn to a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where English has been adopted as the assumed language of neutrality, we get to see that the situation is not that straightforward. While English may be able to resolve certain types of tensions between different ethnic communities, oftentimes the promotion of English indirectly opens up other kinds of conflicts. For example, it widens the gap between the rich and the poor. So whenever we attach certain kinds of ideologies to languages, it could reinforce some potential conflicts that already exist or open up new conflicts. So this kind of allows us to step back and more critically reflect upon whether English is really a neutral language, especially in such a conflict-afflicted context. So the next page. So the last thing that emerged in the interview data that we have identified so far is currently labeled as Shakespeare and Dickens. And this draws our attention to the relationship between language, knowledge, and power. This participant over here is very frustrated about how certain types of Western Eurocentric knowledge are kind of forced on their students. For example, this participant says she's unhappy that certain faculty members in the literature department only teach Shakespeare and Dickens. This participant emphasized that it would be okay if there were a comparative perspective introduced into these courses, for example, comparing Shakespeare or Salman Rushdie. However, the fact that only certain types of knowledge are privileged makes this type of teaching very problematic. So this points towards the geopolitics of knowledge and how changing the medium instruction to one language or another is not just a technical issue. It often affects the epistemic landscape in academia, and this is an aspect that is not so much discussed, unfortunately, in the current EMI literature. So next page. So returning to current definitions and understanding of EMI, I suppose for those of you who are familiar with EMI research, Maccaro's definition of EMI that was published in 2018 is very widely cited. And K-State University that we just looked at falls under this definition. A lot of EMI studies to date have addressed a number of questions, such as the ones listed over here. Who are the actors behind the use of the English language? How much use are we talking about? What kind of English language is it? Most of these are very technical. There have not been enough discussions placed on the interplay between language, culture, and knowledge, which are the aspects that we've talked about in the 4 themes just now. So next page. EMI is also a very widely researched topic in Korea and is very much promoted in many universities, although we also understand that there are lots of tensions underneath it. In East Asia, countries that were former colonies of the United Kingdom, like Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore, have adopted EMI for decades, while others like Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan have only joined the EMI movement since the early 2000s. A number of notable EMI publications from Korea in the past 10 years are listed over here. I highly recommend them. And the next page, please. Among the number of issues that can be identified in these EMI publications based in Korea also centers around language issues. And oftentimes it is that it's not necessary that the students lack the English proficiency to cope with EMI, but they find learning in English is not as satisfactory, or it doesn't feel that they have learned as much as they would do so in the Korean language. Similar sentiments can also be found among Korean faculty members. It's not that their English proficiency is not good, they publish in English, but that to teach in English compared to teaching in Korean, it's a totally different experience. As can be seen in the themes that were discussed, language is very much implicated in the construction and communication of knowledge. Switching the code, the linguistic code to build knowledge could subtly, in very nuanced way, change the content that we're actually teaching. It would change the theories that we draw on, the examples that we used, how we interact with these students, all of these dimensions. And are these discussed enough in the current literature? Perhaps this is an area that could be further developed. A lot of the recommendations that appear in these publications suggest that more language support should be provided to the students, especially EAP and ESP. And they also encourage content lectures to work more closely with language lectures, and also for policy to prioritize learning outcomes, not just ranking and promoting the image of internationalizations. So these are also more focused on the language technical level. There have been slowly a small growing number of studies that look into intercultural issues in EMI context in Korea. For example, the studies in the previous slide written by Kim. In those studies, the authors discuss how different accents are perceived, different learning behaviors and different work culture among students who come from multilingual and multicultural backgrounds. So to wrap up, what can we learn from the Emi case in Afghanistan? I would say a starting point is to think about whether the 4 themes that were discussed are also found in the Korean context. For example, do we also see this idea or get a sense of this idea of liberal white savior mentality among certain faculty in Korea? If we see it, then how do we respond to them? Do we also see uncomfortable discussions related to accent and race in Korea? If students come to you and complain about it, how do we address them? Are we teaching different accents? Are we supporting our faculty members who are not from the English-speaking countries and kind of changing or being part of the process of policy making to change how decisions are made currently? And also in terms of English, Korean, and all the other languages that exist in the university space that you work in, how are these different languages categorized in universities? Are they put into a hierarchy? Are there any chances for them to interact? Why are they placed in certain spaces but not others? And finally, in terms of language and knowledge, how are we basing our decisions of what to include in our curriculum and what not to include? Are we giving enough space for Korean knowledge or different types of knowledge from non-Europe or non-Western context in the classroom? And I think the idea of border thinking that Kevin talked about is also very useful in this process. It helps us to examine how different kinds of linguistic, epistemic, and cultural categories are produced, reproduced, and maintained in EMI settings. So this is what I'd like to share so far, and we can open, I guess, Kevin, should we open the floor to questions, or would you like to go into talking about the decolonial toolkit?
Thanks, Cindy. So the rest of the paper, what we do is we apply the post-abyssal border thinking theoretical lens that I discussed earlier to this data, and then we theorize from it in order to develop a conflict-sensitive toolkit. We're not going to go into that now because I think it's more fruitful to open up to a dialogue and to hear what some of your comments and ideas are at the moment. But just to give you the idea of what the direction of the project is going in, it's the theorization of how do we use these techniques and these strategies and ideas back here in the Korean context. And then conversely, what does the Korean context have to contribute to those scholars and practitioners that are working overseas in different contexts? But we'd like to go back to the discussion we were having with Michael and any of the other questions that the rest of you have to debate this for about 10 minutes.
Leonie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, as Cindy was talking about this whole thing of, the code switching language situation, I so remembered one of the things that has also then come up now in the chat, this E2 visa for South Africans, because South Africa has 11 official languages. What happens, or what happened in my case, when I was growing up, we had 2 official languages, Afrikaans and English. And I was an Afrikaans speaker. And so all of my primary and secondary schooling happened in Afrikaans. But English was a subject in all of that. When I went to university, all of the subjects were taught in English. So there I had to now code switch, if you like. But it was easy for me because English was a language that surrounded me and that I was immersed in. And I had friends who spoke English. And so therefore I was using both languages on an equal footing the whole time. And I think this is one of the things that in the multicultural situation is not always recognized. To what extent is English in the society a language that is in daily use? Because if it is not, then suddenly expecting people to code switch is going to be problematic. So that's me.
Thank you for sharing the context in South Africa. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to jump in with a question or a comment?
Have you guys ever heard the term lingering colonialism?
Not familiar with it.
Okay, good, because apparently, and I don't mind talking about it, apparently the plenary lineup that I came up with for this conference is evidence of a lingering colonialism. And I'm not really, I don't know how to feel about it because I've never heard that term before. So you guys haven't heard it either, so that's fine. I'll move on to another.
Michael, can I respond to it?
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't know that specific term, lingering colonialism, but I think that I know where it's being detached or taken from. Okay. So the scholars in decolonial thinking talk about a colonial matrix of power. Now, this is just a fancy way to say what they're trying to indicate is that even though official colonialism has ended, according to the UN in 1990, whatever, colonialism is done. Like there are no more states that are, controlled by colonial powers. So the physical geopolitical aspect of it is done. But doesn't mean, of course, what post-colonialism tells us, that doesn't mean that the psychological colonialism hasn't continued. And so what I expect by lingering colonialism is they're getting toward the psychological part of it and the way that colonialism is still deeply embedded within our policies and the politics of our states. So I don't know that that's what they mean, but that's what I would probably extrapolate from it.
that's a much more articulate and intelligent way but it's similar to what I was thinking. It seemed to me like the person had maybe he had a problem that he was trying to find an example for. I'm not too sure. But the idea to me of colonialism in ELT is that it's, we're bringing in, it's Western dominated, and I happen to be, what is it, a stale pale male or whatever it is that I am, or an almost old white guy, which, hey, I am, so good. But when I look at the line of people, we don't just have people from, the normal West. We've got people from South America, we've got people from Japan, we've got people who are, we are as diverse a group of plenary speakers as we've ever had. So I was a little bit confused, but maybe I am, I don't know. Another question that I have is, for EMI, a lot of universities in Korea are trying to attract international students now for reasons that you articulated so well. The Koreans are going extinct, not to put too fine a point on it, and they've got more universities than people, so they need international bodies. So they have this thing where we're going to teach everything in English. We're going to teach it in English. And I'm wondering, hey, you know what? I was trained in music history, music appreciation. It's a great liberal arts course. It'd be perfect for EMI. Can I teach the history of Western music now without being a colonialist? I would think that I can, as long as you don't use the whole great music thing with a capital G, like Beethoven isn't great anymore. He's not a hack, which was what someone said, who's an idiot. But so if we take the uppercase G and we make it lowercase, can I tell them about it? Because I love it. It's great. It's great stuff. It's stuff that people would benefit from learning from. But am I a colonialist if I do it? I don't think so.
Yeah.
How do I approach that?
Yeah, so I think for me, what's coming out from this particular idea, Cindy brought this up when she was presenting about liberal white saviorism in Afghanistan, and the human rights and democracy as concepts in and of themselves are not the problematique. That's not the problem. The issue is that assuming that human rights and democracy and enlightenment are a Western creation, that the West owns that, is the problem. Because there are local rights, local interpretations, ideas about human rights and about democracy that are from the context of Afghanistan or the context of Korea. And when we come in and bring in the idea that democracy and human rights are from the West, we are disenfranchising local knowledge. So I think another way that another scholar talks about this, Gudmundur Bombra, talks about it as connected sociologies. And I think what we want to do is to avoid the artificial dichotomy, whether that's created by common parlance, like the way that people common sense think, or if that's in the theory that so-called woke scholars are utilizing to say that there's a dichotomy between a West and rest of the world or a North and South. The connected sociology shows us how trigonometry and advanced mathematics come from Persia. But in our Western teaching of it, we frequently erase that part of the history. So rather than saying it's Western, we need to embrace the fact that it's global and we have connected sociologies. So to answer your question, no, there's nothing wrong with teaching Western music. In fact, from my standpoint, also as somebody who studied music composition, the orchestra in symphony is one of the greatest products of Western civilization. So that in itself is not a problem. We have to put it within its context and its history and indicate the linkages that it has for the local context that we're teaching. So it's really a question for me about whether or not we're imposing upon a local community, disenfranchising them, not embracing and acknowledging the local wisdom and knowledge that exists, or if rather we're in a true sort of egalitarian dialogue with each other. So I would say no, that there's not a problem with that to your question, but how do we embrace local knowledges as well?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Sandy, go.
No, I was just going to say that I agree with what Kevin was saying. So oftentimes when we talk about it, it could feel that we're resisting the West, but it's not that. We definitely, I think that is the value of border thinking and post-abyssal thinking again, is to go beyond these dichotomic ways of thinking. So as like one of the things that emerged in the data about Shakespeare and Dickens is not that we shouldn't teach Shakespeare and Dickens, but if we bring in a comparative perspective into it, it could open up like a very rich conversations about literature. So, and if we go beyond the classroom space, so for example, Michael would like to teach the history of Western music. Is that correct? So for example, if we look beyond that, his classroom, and to look at how the entire curriculum at the university is presented, there are different aspects that all come together, right? So it's not erasing a particular history, but kind of bring everything together and not overgeneralizing Western music as claiming it as it's the only way to do music, or it is a universal way to do music. In language education related literature, there's this idea of provincializing the West. So I think oftentimes right now there's a lot of critique against the West because it is considered universal, or it is the best way to do everything. But if we provincialize it, so it is only one way to look at music, it is only one way to look at history, then this is perhaps a healthier way to go forward and opens up a wide range of space for non-Western epistemologies to come into our curriculum and into our classroom.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly, along those lines. This idea that this is the right way to do things, and it of course cuts both ways. That very often the indigenous thinking is also saying this is the only right way to do things. And we need to have that dialogue.
Right.
And one of the dialogues that I'm having a lot with my adult learners, that I teach English, and I don't teach English as a subject. What I do is I have English conversation classes, and I have a wide range of topics. And I always encourage them, and I try to find contact points where they can bring the Bulgarian, Moroccan, Swiss, Irish, Afghanistan, Pakistan, which is generally what my classroom looks like at the moment, experience into that particular topic. And that is resulting in some wonderful conversations where we have 2 hours available to us in the classroom. And at the end of the 2 hours, I always have to say, I'm sorry, we have to stop there. And everyone goes, no. So I think that's one of the things that works in favor of then teaching a subject in English, because you're opening it up.
Yeah. And I'm aware that we're a little bit over time. So I think what I'm going to do is share one last anecdote, and then we'll wrap it up here and leave. And Cindy and I thank you so much for all of the rich discussion. But there's one thing I want to share because it emerges out of this conversation. So I think really to bring the decolonial thought back into the conflict sensitive teaching, the idea is that as pedagogues, we want to spend some time learning about the context from which our students come, and learning about the challenges, the traumas that they've experienced, and giving thought to how that means that I would work differently with these students than I might with others. So here's an example from the data set that we got, that participant 1 shared with me a very surprising case where she was a lecturer that was invited to go into Afghanistan to teach in the university there. She started with a colleague who says, I was recruited her colleague was a physics professor who was recruited from Geneva, who went into Afghanistan knowing had no idea it was a war zone, no idea that it was a conflict-affected context. So this colleague comes in to talk, sharing this with me, and she says this: "No one told me this is a conflict zone." And then 2 weeks later, she's gone. So the point here is whether we're going into a conflict-affected context or we have students coming from conflict-affected context, we do due diligence toward learning where we're teaching and the type of students that we're teaching. And how does that affect the knowledge that we teach, the way that we teach that particular knowledge? How do we embrace and care for those students and what their needs are? Because the trauma of conflict carries in the muscles of those students. And they don't leave them simply because they've left that context. And are there things in that class that might trigger and put them back into that conflict situation immediately? So these, in the instructors, the participants who shared their ideas with me, as Cindy and I said, they gave us a lot of different techniques or ideas on how they try to facilitate that conflict sensitive teaching. And we'll be putting that into a paper that we eventually publish at some point. So we'll share that with you later. But I just wanted to share this in response to what Michael and Leonie were saying in terms of trying to figure out how to embrace the local culture, how to embrace the culture from which our students are coming from, and to do due diligence of respect with those students. Okay, with that, we're going to end now, but we want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Thank you all. And Michael, I'll leave it to you to wrap it up and to close off the session.
Okay, well, we actually have a few more minutes because we've got a break at 3 o'clock until 3:30 before the next session. So we can hang around and chat a little bit more if you like. Yeah. So yeah, we have time. If you're happy to go away, that's okay too. You can go to the Discord server. You can go have a cup of water, hug your kids.
I'm happy to sit here and keep drinking coffee with you.
Feed your plants or whatever. I just sent to Professor Chang the opening my opening question for the native speakerism panel, which I'll just take a moment to explain. We're going to talk about the problem of native speakerism, that what native speakerism is pretty easy, sort of, in general, and that it's a problem is pretty easy to articulate in general. But the real question, my way of kind of getting into the discussion in a different way or coming at it from a different angle, at least the beginning, is to ask why we haven't solved it yet. Because I mean by we, I mean like ELT, it's not rocket science. It's not a good idea. It reinforces things that most reasonable people, no matter where they're from, think is bad. Oh my, maybe that's a universal that I'm imposing on other people. So why haven't we figured this out? And we might yay COVID, because we've got panelists coming in from all over the world. One or maybe two might not show up, we're not sure. So you guys can think about that for a while and then contribute to the discussion and fill things out if you want. You don't have to.
Definitely.
I think this is a very important topic, and it's also very messy as well. I think I'm less optimistic than you. Like, I feel it can't be solved in the short term. Also because I feel the categories of native and non-native is also so rigid. Like, there's so many spaces in between, right? So the whole discourse of like critiquing native speakerism, like, it's not fair because you're a native speaker. Sometimes, for example, I don't know where I am situated. I'm kind of native, but not exactly native. So where do I belong? Is it based on the nationality on my passport, my proficiency level, where I received my highest degree, how I look? So there's just so many factors contributing to it. And I mean, I guess a better way is to open up a space for us to explain the different dimensions or variables that can influence how we perceive our language is. But oftentimes when it comes to policy making, lots of decisions have to be made very efficiently. So how can we communicate what represents us in an efficient way that is not essentialist? I think that is the challenge.
Mm-hmm. I think
that we're
Cheryl,
facing
Cheryl
right
had
now.
something. Cheryl had something she wanted to ask, and I don't want to.
Oh, okay,
Well,
sorry.
it's a little bit changing the topic, so I'm not sure if there's more to say on
Go
this. I
ahead.
mean, I was really curious about the what in your research, what you've seen so far about trauma and how schools and teachers, like you've talked, use the term conflict sensitive. How are they addressing trauma in that? And you've talked at the end a little bit about that. Like, is there, I mean, in the second quote that you shared, you know, talking about Dari and Pashto and English being kind of a neutral language in that context. Like, is there a role for English medium instruction in terms of creating space for traumatized learners who might be where that could be a safe place? And then if so, how does, like, are any of the universities doing that kind of thing? And do they, like, what kind of training do they provide for teachers? Because if it's English medium instruction, people are coming from a variety of different fields and backgrounds, but to have that kind of trauma sensitive or conflict sensitive awareness is not just natural to everybody. So I'm curious, like, what you found, like, are universities doing that kind of thing? Are they kind of not just like being aware of the trauma and trying not to, like, trigger students in class, but are there actual, like, efforts to create places for not necessarily healing, but that could be contributing to healing in the course of the education?
Yeah, Cindy, I'll respond first, and then you.
Yes. I was thinking that definitely, like, thank you, Sharon, for raising that. And it was definitely, I would say, another theme that emerged, but because it was somehow, to some extent, a little bit beyond language, so we didn't really talk about it today, but
Okay.
I think Kevin can talk a lot about it.
Yeah.
I think there's two really fascinating things coming out of it, Cheryl, and one of them you brought up. And with border thinking in particular, I think this allows English, the complexity of English, to come out a little bit more, maybe a bit of what Michael's getting at, is there were participants who spoke in that context about the safety that English allowed them. So they were local Afghani students, adults, but university students, who expressed that English provides them a safety net for conversation with their other peers, so that those in Dari or Pashto can't understand what they're saying. So, for example, women, if two women are at the university having a conversation over a coffee and they don't want to be overheard, English might provide them a space where they feel like not only is it safe because other people can't understand what we're saying, mostly, but it also, obviously, as we all know, the language itself opens up a capacity for different conversation based off of the way that we think in English versus the way that thinking happens in different languages that just wouldn't happen in Dari or Pashto. So there were expressions of that where the faculty were looking at the positives of EMI, not just at some of the complications, but can this open up something more beautiful? Now, in terms of what the faculty did with it, yeah, they created a lot of institutional policies. So one of the participants has essentially become fairly high up in the university to start to have influence on policy making. So in addition to bringing in Pashto as a language at the university, not just Dari and English, which was meant to help some form of reconciliation, as you say, so recognition for those from Pashto communities, the allowance of students from English and Dari to learn that other language. So that was an intentional response, was like, wait, we can't be exclusive. Particularly if Pashto is, affiliated in that context with the Taliban and with terrorism, we need to separate the language from the terrorist acts in the same way that many people often speak about separating religion from terrorism. So we can't conflate these two. And so the university made policy intentional to separate those. The other one was an orientation program that they created. So in response to the very, again, shocking quote that I read about somebody moving from Switzerland to Afghanistan, and just not knowing it, that there was a war going on. So implemented a policy, was like, we need to train our faculty.
Yeah.
Like, we need better hiring policies to weed them out.
Mm-hmm.
We also need, when they get here, to train them in local culture, how to be sensitive locally. And so what that meant specifically for their training program was they bring in a lecturer of Afghani and Central Asian history, and they teach them the history of Afghanistan, intentionally to separate Pashto from Taliban, so that there's not conflation of those ideas. So they try to clarify what are different cultural points there. So yeah, a lot of it led to specific policies in the university. Yeah, so I think that's good. We'll let Cindy respond.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think Kevin pretty much covered a lot of the aspects that emerge in the interview data. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl, for the question. And of course, with everything that we're doing right now, it's still evolving. So I know there are pedagogical strategies as well that would be more clear as we go forward, and then we can share those back with you as well.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what that looks like in the classroom, and if there is that kind of more positive approach. I mean, it's not like they're going back to another kind of language for their overall instruction. So as they move forward, what policies, but also instructional strategies and curriculum decisions are they making, teacher training, all those kinds of things, to be able to create spaces that can be really context sensitive in that way.
So you just remind me, Cheryl, there was this particular participant teaches English language. So she was an ESL participant. And so not English language and literature as a subject, but she was teaching ESL. And she told me that what she does in her classes, similar to what Cindy was presenting, was she said that she tries to be sure to find literature that is localized. So what this meant for, it has to be in English, right? So as you said, we're not going away from English, that's going to stay. But how can we, to a certain degree, localize the curriculum of what is being taught and the discussions we have? So she gave it, it might seem very mundane, but she gave the example of using the kite runner. And so she said for her, what that meant, translating into her pedagogy, was that she brings the kite runner in as a book that, even though it's written by an Afghani American in California, it has local ethnic conflicts in the book, and it paints pictures of Kabul that the students are familiar with. So it brings the learning back home for them. And this participant was linking this approach that she was using to Freire. She said, I'm doing this because of critical pedagogy. This is from Freirean ideas of making the knowledge localized for my students, and starting from the curriculum starts from their experiences.
Right.
So I think that's one very concrete example that a participant explained about the pedagogical responses.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to run too. So thank you so much for the conversation and for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to the publications you're working on and just seeing this research evolve as it goes.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to this session. Yeah. I think I'm going to grab coffee, and Michael's session will start at
3:30.
Okay, I'll take a rest first. I'll let you guys continue.
Why don't we,